So my name's Rachel Brown. I'm a consultant psychiatrist in the NHS in Edinburgh. So I work in a crisis team in the NHS, and I also have an independent private practice, which is a functional medicine focused practice.
There was a video on YouTube set up by Amber O'Hearn. She spoke about having gone through different mental health therapies, but never being able to kind of tie everything together. Intellectually, she understood, that what she was thinking and how she was going about life was wrong. But it wasn't until she switched her diet that she kind of had the motivation to actually put the theories and therapies into practice. And that got me thinking about not only mental health in the kind of in the extreme sense, so the psychosis and the bipolar, but I was also thinking about it in terms of like minor personality disorders, in like self-esteem and confidence. Like, is it a stretch to say that there are certain foods that could trigger a lack of self-esteem?
I don't think that's a stretch at all because I think any symptom of mental disorder is a sign that there's some underlying dysfunction on a physical basis, on a biochemical basis. A lot of it comes down to oxidative stress and inflammation in the body. And so, from my point of view, our psychiatric diagnoses are artificial constructs in a way because we just group together certain symptoms to call it a diagnosis to then be able to go on to usually prescribe treatments for people. So there's so much overlap between all the different disorders. I find it hard to believe that a ketogenic diet, for example, could be so beneficial in relation to controlling bipolar disorder, and for it to not then go on to have benefits in relation to more minor aspects of mental health difficulties. I don't think that absolutely everyone needs to go carnivore.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think you'd be very hard pushed to find a more nutrient dense diet in terms of the bang for the buck that you get in terms of actual nutrients and micronutrients that are in a carnivore diet. I've done a ketogenic diet before I went carnivore, and really the foods that I removed to go from keto to carnivore, I don't think they're any great loss or
Mm-hmm.
that they particularly add a lot in the way of nutritional value to what you would be getting on a carnivore diet. And certainly from a mental health point of view, I know people who had to go the full hog and go carnivore before their mental health symptoms resolved. Whereas for some other people, all they need to do is keto.
Keto and ketogenic is a buzzword, and some people will, perhaps recognize it as a way of eating, but they may not know what that necessarily consists of. So how do you explain the ketogenic diet?
So I usually say to people it's a very low carbohydrate diet. So you are usually looking at restricting carbohydrates. Um, there's a bit of individual variation in terms of how restrictive you need to be, but for a lot of people starting out, aiming for 20 grams or less of carbohydrate content is the rough ballpark figure that you need to aim for. And otherwise, it's a high fat, moderate protein diet. So we have the three macronutrients: fats, proteins, and carbs. And really, you're basing your diet around the fats and the proteins, which are the essential building blocks of every aspect of our body. And in terms of foods that people tend to include, then it would be focused around real whole foods would always be my suggestion. And a fair bit of that will be animal foods, so meat, fish, eggs. Some people manage with high fat dairy. Other people can't do that, and it can be problematic for some people. And then very low carbohydrate fruit and vegetables, if people want to include those. You essentially just want to switch your body into a fat burning state.
Mm-hmm.
So I think with modern day diets and the amount of processed food and just the carbohydrate levels that the average person takes in, really people have lost that metabolic flexibility of being able to run on both fats and glucose. And so you're really wanting to switch your body over from being a carbohydrate burner to being a fat burner. And it takes a couple of weeks to get into proper ketosis and go through a transition phase. And sometimes people feel a bit rough doing that because they're actually having changes at the level of the cell in the body. So there's lots of talk about mitochondria, which some people will be interested in, others maybe don't want to know that sort of level of detail. But essentially, it's your mitochondria that change when you're switching over your metabolism from burning carbs to burning fats.
And when someone says that they are, I particularly tend to hear this with women when they say they're craving carbs. Sometimes depending on what part of their cycle as well, they'll have this so-called craving for carbohydrates and sweet stuff. So is it that craving is misinterpreted as something else, or is it that they actually need to have carbohydrates or sugars at that period of their cycle?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and probably a bit tricky to answer definitively for everyone, because I think there will be some individual variation. But certainly, from my own perspective and from other females that I know who follow a ketogenic lifestyle, there isn't really any clear evidence that people need carbs at a certain time of their cycle in order to have good sort of hormonal control. I think a huge issue that probably doesn't receive enough attention is food addiction, and that's a huge topic in itself. So I think if somebody is experiencing food cravings, there can be all sorts of reasons for that. There can be micronutrient deficiencies, or there could be hormonal imbalances. So estrogen dominance is a huge issue these days because there are so many estrogens that we take in from the environment, never mind anything else. And so hormonal dysregulation, of course, could lead to some cravings. But usually I find that people find that they do well on a ketogenic diet.
Could it be a case of also maybe under eating?
Oh yeah, and I think particularly for women that can be a huge issue from what I hear from people. And that's a societal thing, I think, that it's just been drummed into us that women should order the salad and eat smaller portions and so on. And actually, I think there's something that happens when you go ketogenic, because I'm not saying that calories don't matter at all, but I think fat is a hormonal issue primarily, and we've been given a lot of bad information about calories in and calories out. And so I think actually some people can be very surprised if they were to count calories, how much they can actually consume on a ketogenic diet and continue to lose weight and do well health-wise.
And it's not only carbohydrates that are an issue in terms of insulin resistance. Like, what else can impact somebody's insulin resistance that basically can also affect their mental health?
Well, seed oils is a big one. So including seed oils, or sometimes they're called vegetable oils, they can definitely induce insulin resistance. And I know there's a lot of high level debate that goes on between different experts about which is the bigger cause. Is it seed oils that ultimately causes insulin resistance, or is it the carbohydrates? I suspect the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, where it's actually both are an issue. I have to admit I have a real moral and ethical dilemma now, knowing what I know and working within mainstream psychiatry, because many of the medications we prescribe induce insulin resistance and can induce it fairly quickly. So antipsychotics, for example, can make somebody insulin resistant within a week of taking those drugs. But we also know that other medications we use, such as antidepressants, do have effects on the mitochondria, and not in a good way. And there are other aspects of medications, such as medications being deuterated. So deuterium is an issue that affects mitochondrial function. So although I think medications can be really helpful for some people in the short term, I would have concern about people remaining on medication very long term, because we know that a lot of these medications can cause weight gain and increase the risk of type 2 diabetes and heart disease. And a lot of this comes from inducing insulin resistance as the mechanism. So I suppose one thing to say is that definitely people can be on psychiatric medication and follow a ketogenic diet, and it is possible to get into ketosis. while you're on medication, but you just might need to work with somebody who's knowledgeable to be able to troubleshoot and give advice if anyone's having any difficulties. But actually, a ketogenic diet, even if we didn't think about the mental health benefits, it's something worthwhile doing if you're on psychiatric medication, just to try to counteract the potential side effects that can come from those medications.
Okay. And kind of maybe linked to that moral dilemma, well, I'll start off asking, what benefits could somebody achieve with their mental health if they followed a plant-based diet?
Oh, so I personally would never recommend to somebody that they follow a plant-based diet when it comes to improving their mental health. Just because there are so many nutrients within animal-based products that you just cannot get on a plant-based diet. And it's not necessarily the most obvious vitamin B12, for example, but it can be things like carnitine and carnosine, and other compounds, peptide protein compounds that come particularly in red meat. And we know from studies, I mentioned it in my book, that those have been shown to reduce oxidative stress at the level of the nerves in your brain. And so there are many other reasons to include animal products in the diet. Having said that, I think if somebody moves from a very junk food, processed food diet to a clean plant-based diet, they might well experience some benefits, purely from removing probably the vegetable oils, the seed oils from their diet, and more of the highly processed food. But again, long term, it's not something I would recommend to people.